Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
There's some pretty pictures in this article, too.
That's like one of the ways I rank articles to, does it have any pretty pictures? It's like number one. Topic area, number two.
Yeah, my favorite thing is some of the journals today, they start asking for like high quality art and like illustrations of experimental design and stuff like that. And I'm like, the best I can do is an iPhone picture. And it may even be a picture of a picture.
Have you ever, that's horrible. Don't you love that when you get pictures from people asking you about something and it's a picture of their screen?
Never screenshotted an image on a computer and use that in a research publication, like a figure. I've never done that.
Who would do that?
You guys have wanted to do this when they ask for the high quality art. Have you ever just wanted to draw like a stick figure picture and submit that to them and see how they respond?
It's the best I can do.
Will and I were talking about in one of the episodes that we need to just come up with some arbitrary metric that we could measure everything in. I think it was the Alabama's episode or something. Yeah, we should just come up with some arbitrary metrics. That's exactly what we need in peer-reviewed science, is shake things up,
Let's measure things by length of the average turkey spur.
Yeah.
It was 56 spur lengths.
I like toe length better,
Yeah.
That's
more standard.
More about the bird, yeah.
The problem with spur length, it'd be like 12 of Will's for every 2 of mine. So you can't.
What are you comparing my pinky toe to your big toe?
Will's over here shooting
talking about spurs, man.
The spurless turkeys are rare. So he's out here just whacking the rare ones.
I have a turkey that I killed that does not have spurs. It was not a hen. It was a gobbler longbeard, but it was spurless. I killed it in Sumter County and where I grew up. And it was, so for my honeymoon, or not my honeymoon, my pre-wedding travel trip, I went with several guys around the South and we hunted in each turkey season. And while we were in Alabama, I killed that turkey with Coulter Chitwood. He and I were hunting together, and 2 gobblers came in, and they didn't present the opportunity because they flew over us and then came in from behind us. It was a really weird thing, but the turkeys came in from behind us, and I ended up having to shoot one, and it just happened to not have spurs.
Those birds are rare, but I figured out a way to identify them more easily if you can't, you're not close enough to see their spurs. Like a lot of times they'll have like a really short beard and the outside feathers for some reason on their fan are a little bit shorter too. And those are key indicators that it might not have spurs.
Yeah. No, this was a long beard.
All right, we digress.
Its feet also look like hen feet. Like it was just, the legs were small. It was weird.
What was his beard like?
It was like, I think it was 11 or 11 and a half inch beard. It was a nice beard.
Interesting.
But I have it mounted in my office.
Yeah. He's put more effort into his beard to, maybe a snoot as well.
Yeah. The other bird was clearly the dominant bird that was gobbling. He was strutting, he was doing all the stuff. It just, the one, I shoot the one that gives me the opportunity. And they were not going to give it, like the way they came in, there was a bunch of cover, and we weren't going to get another chance. It was now or never, and the one that poked his head out that had a long beard was the one I shot. I wasn't worried about who was gobbling or whatever. So
that's the way to do it.
Yeah, but it was spurless. All right. Well, good episode, guys. Guess we can wrap this up.
Cool story, bro. All right, Marcus, you do the introduction today.
Okay.
I think you can handle this one.
Yeah, Mark, is your name Mark? I'm just kidding. Well, we've talked about on a couple of episodes, and we've gotten some support for this from the audience. A lot of the work that we talk about is not generated by the people talking about it. It's generated by graduate students who are out there, working themselves to death, trying to collect this, a lot of really great data.
The unsung heroes of conservation.
Yeah, you and I did that, Will. We've been through that. We know what it's like. And, I can remember being in it, and I enjoyed it a lot. At least looking back on it, I did. But it was hard. And, it's nice to be able to talk directly about that to people while you're in it. So we have decided we're going to try to bring in some of the unsung heroes, and one of those people is our guest today. So, Mark, I really appreciate you taking some time to meet with us. I know you need to be out there measuring the height of some plants or something, but I really appreciate it. I don't remember how long I've known you, but it's probably been better than a decade or so, right? Wasn't it your undergrad first, freshman at NC State when we first met?
Yeah, so it's been a few years.
Yeah, so that was the first time I met you. And then you went on to get a master's degree in Will Goolsby's lab.
That's correct.
Somehow escaped from that situation.
Made it out. Did really cool work, and I'm sure we'll talk about that some today. Really cool work in his lab, and now you're at the University of Tennessee in Dr. Craig Harper's lab. So I know their audience is familiar with him, but you're one of the soldiers out there really getting it done. So we wanted you to come on and share some of your experience and talk about some of the really cool work that you're doing and how it might improve habitat management for turkeys on people's land. So hopefully that was a sufficient introduction, Will, if you need to
I'll give it a
add
B.
anything. So we've got Mark Turner, not quite Dr. Turner, but maybe soon.
Hopefully so.
Yeah, so
I appreciate y'all having me on.
Yeah, Mark. So why don't you start out by just giving us kind of a quick rundown of how you got to the position you're in right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just like a lot of folks in this field, grew up hunting and fishing. I'm originally from the central North Carolina. Have a family farm there in the northern Piedmont, and so as I was growing up, as I got into high school, I got into hunting. Interestingly, really didn't have anyone in my family to teach me, so it was kind of just on my own learning. And I think the number of things that I screwed up learning how to, especially deer hunt, and then after that turkey hunt, really kind of drove me to become passionate about this stuff. Ended up going on to pursue an undergrad at NC State, and like Marcus said, we first met there. Was really interested in habitat management work for especially deer at the time, as well as turkeys and other species. But really, habitat management's kind of the thing that got me fired up. Did a lot of work on my family farm during undergraduate, and realized I wanted to go on to pursue a master's, and so ended up applying and getting accepted down at Auburn. Will and I worked together on a project looking at coastal plain hardwood management for deer and turkeys in Alabama. So did some cool work there with forest stand improvement, prescribed fire. And then as I wrapped that up, realized that, I'm a glutton for punishment, just wanted to keep on rolling. And so ended up worked out during my master's degree, was working with Dr. Harper. He was on my committee. And so just in conversations with him, a project came open in Tennessee working on deer. And so that's where I am now. So hopefully going to be finishing up in the next few months and entering the real world.
Yeah, so hopefully, I think, Marcus and I are kind of as weird as it is to say, almost like mid-career right now. I don't know how that's
Yeah, you
possible.
definitely are, Will.
And then I don't know. I see a little bit more gray in that beard. Toxie was giving you compliments on it, but
Yeah, it just makes me look distinguished.
do you use the Just for Men with a touch of gray in it, just to leave a little bit of it, or?
Yeah, I actually use the gray coloration.
Oh, okay, okay.
I'm
I think
increasing
that's
To
a
look
new
gray.
podcast sponsor right there.
to look more dignified, but
Pause for your sponsored spot.
Well, now I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so hopefully Mark is going to be coming in as the next generation, because we've got the generation ahead of Marcus and I. It's they're getting ready to retire. They're in 4 or 5 years of retirement, and so there's going to be a lot of big shoes left to fill here in the coming years.
Yeah, that's good because there should be some opportunities for Mark
Mhm.
coming up, assuming that you can pass your dissertation defense and all that good stuff.
Well, I got this one committee member that can be kind of problematic. He'll start digging into the ecology and trying to make me think about things. So, yeah, Marcus is on my committee, so he's worked on my project as well. So,
Blink twice if you're being held captive.
Hey, I'm the one in the padded room here. Okay.
Well, he can speak freely in front of me now. He's out from under my thumb, but he's under yours still.
Not really.
So Mark, tell us about this recent paper that y'all published that we kind of want to talk about today that has to do with fire seasonality. Tell us the context of the study area and how all this came to be.
yeah, so this project, I guess really I should back up and Marcus interject here because, it was your work originally. This study area and this study was actually kind of set up by some stuff that um, Marcus and Michael McCord and I don't know who else was involved in that original Chuck Swan study.
Ryan Basinger with Westervelt.
Yeah, yeah. So they were all looking at, obviously several years ago, um, fire effects and managing upland hardwoods with fire at this WMA, Chuck Swan State Forest and Wildlife Management area in Tennessee. And they were all previous students working with Dr. Harper. And so after they graduated, the initial stands that they were working in ended up being harvested. But he wanted to set up kind of a separate project looking at specifically fire seasonality effects in upland hardwoods. That's not something that many people have done, especially using growing season fire. And so back in 2010, which was well before I entered the field, these stands were divided up and they applied a shelterwood harvest, which essentially, if you're not familiar, that's a regeneration harvest that is used where you leave generally about 50% of the basal area, allow somewhere between 30 and 40% sunlight. And you're typically trying to retain oaks with those harvests. So, really good in terms of trying to regenerate oaks and also, provide a lot of mass for species during that time period whenever those oaks are starting to regenerate. And there's been some previous work pairing shelterwood harvest with fire. But essentially what Dr. Harper was trying to look at was how several fires during different seasons might lead to different plant community responses as well as wildlife values within those stands. So again, they were cut initially in 2010, and then over the next 13 years, all the previous grad students as well as myself here towards the tail end were burning those stands during either the early growing season, which is during April and May, or during the late growing season, which was during September and October, at least in our part of the world. And so those stands have been burned six times over that period for an average of about a 2.2 year fire return interval. So pretty frequent fire in an upland oak system.
Did either of y'all get to participate in any of these fires?
I think Marcus would have been gone by then, wouldn't you have been?
Yeah, I was already gone. I did a lot of burning on various projects up in that region, in different capacities, but not on those specific plots.
Yeah, the first thing that came to mind for me is, because you remember, Mark, obviously when you were here working on your project, we were burning those hardwood stands during the dormant season. And sometimes it can even be difficult, during that time of the year. So what conditions were you looking for to burn these stands in the early and late growing season, and what was the fire behavior like?
Right. And I think that's a good point to bring up. And I think the first thing I want to mention with that is that the species composition is really what's driving the the initial difference in intensity. So like whenever I was working in Alabama, those stands, they're upland hardwood stands, but a lot of the species are bottomlands
Right.
species, and especially water oak, does not burn that well, does not dry out that well. And so whenever we were burning down there, we were really, shooting for humidities down in like the 20s, the high 20s, to get that to burn.
Sometimes
We're able
even in
to,
the low 20s.
or in the teens.
I don't recommend that.
Yeah,
Man,
exactly.
you drop a match in Florida in the 17, you're not going to be
Yeah,
doing good.
Well,
yeah, it's.
we did get some bonus acres in that day.
I wasn't a part of that one, I don't think, but
No, that was right after you had left.
yeah. See, that's a good time to just ease on from the project after a bunch of
Just to provide
snacks are left in the stand and everything else. Yeah.
Yeah, just to provide some context on that one, we were burning on a really low RH day. I don't think that day was in the teens, but it was at least as low as 23% relative humidity. And had a little bit of wind here and there, and we were generally fine most of the day. But I had taken a new graduate student with me. It was her first burn, and I give them my pre-burn, first burn speech every time, and it's pretty much the same. And as part of that, I always say, just first and foremost, make sure that you're dropping fire on the correct side of the fire break. And everybody always laughs at that,
Yes.
but this student, it was like a moment of just they mentally blanked for a second and just kind of like we're holding the drip torch out to the side and turned around, and we just had the fire breaks were blown in with backpack leaf blower. And so just that little movement of turning to the side, turn the drip torch, one drop went on the outside of the fire break, and with that low humidity, we were fighting fire for probably the next hour or so, trying to get that contained. So
Mm.
fun day.
Yeah, always a fun day. But yeah, so with those systems, you definitely have to shoot for pretty low humidity. Um, there's a little bit difference with the species composition up here. These are truly upland stands with dominated by upland oaks. That's most of what was left was white oak, southern red oak. There are a few hickory. There's a few scarlet, a few northern red, but most of it is white oak, southern red oak, scarlet oak. Species that typically, the leaves are pretty well conditioned to burning. So generally, in both those seasons, we were shooting for humidity somewhere between 30 and 40%. Um, you know, in those conditions, you're able to get it to burn. It does need to be drier than you would expect for burning, say, a field or a pine savanna where you'd have a lot of either needle cast or grass. So it does have to be a little drier than you might be used to, but hardwood leaves will burn pretty well. I would say, like I said, somewhere in that 30% humidity range is usually what we were shooting for with burning. But one of the key points that I didn't really fully appreciate until I came up here trying to burn these stands during the growing season was, especially during the early growing season, you have to time it pretty much perfectly to where, you have some leaf out from the understory plants. But once you get past early May in Tennessee, it becomes pretty difficult to burn because of the shading effects from those residual trees.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, that's not the case in a field, or if you're working again in a pine system.
Mm.
Generally there's going to be a little bit less shade. But if you're leaving, enough overstory to shade it, down to where you only have 30 to 40% sunlight, you have to burn before leaf out is complete, unless it's really droughty conditions. Now in the fall, usually we're burning about the time that the leaves start to yellow, start to change color on the trees. That's generally a good time. But I'm not within this study, but I have been on burns here in September, and we've been able to get good fire effects. But the general rule of thumb is if you're burning, especially in the late growing season, you're going to have less intensity, lower flame lengths, slower rate of spread, and also just less complete burn coverage. We averaged only about 65% burn coverage in the late growing season, compared to almost 100% in the early growing season. But that doesn't mean that the fire was a failure, because as we'll get to here in a little bit, we didn't see a huge difference in fire effects based on seasonality. So either one, you can get an effective burn. It's just a matter of waiting for the right day.
So, Mark, with this study, you had 2 times of fire that you're comparing, right?
Yes.
So, what were the full extent? Like, was it March and April, or for the early growing season versus what were the 2 time slots, I guess?
Yeah, so it would have been April and May, about mid-April
May.
into about mid-May, I think was the latest that these were burned. And then in the late growing season, most of the burns in the late growing season were early October. But I do believe there was 1 or 2 that happened in late September as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I've had the same kind of experience, and I know that I have said it multiple times, but even, I've talked about it in the context of closed canopy hardwoods, but in those upland hardwoods, when they're closed canopy and are basically at full shade nearly, I mean, from the beginning of May on through probably early October, it's almost not burnable.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
So, but then I have talked about if you reduce the basal area such that you're getting a lot of sunlight and you're also seeing a transition in fuels, it can become flammable. But it sounds like even with your study, when you got down to 40% sunlight, that's still too much shade where it's really limiting for you to use several months of your potential burn window.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you have some wind and you have really high KBDI values. I mean, it's not impossible necessarily to burn, in like a woodland setting. But until you get at least, the experiences that I've had here, until you get at least 50% sunlight in hardwoods, you're not going to burn. And honestly, even with 50% sunlight, you know, you're going to have areas that don't burn around the trees that are left, just because that shade just slows things down so much. But again, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
I think that's another, important, take home point for managers too is, when they're, creating canopy openings or, doing a thinning to reduce the canopy, and then they're planning on starting the area on a prescribed fire rotation. They hear us talking a lot about these different seasons of fire. And, I think we should be using all seasons of fire. Obviously, we've promoted that in several episodes on this podcast. But one thing to keep in mind is it's okay if you need, those first few rotations to just burn during the wintertime when it's typically easier to burn and you get better conditions to burn until you build up more of that fine fuel in the understory, which will make it easier to start burning during different seasons, especially at points during the growing season.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. A lot of the time, we talk about not trying to promote grass, but it was interesting. I was actually on a class trip, a class that I was teaching to the undergraduates at UT this past fall, and we went to Catoosa, and Don Chance, one of Marcus's previous graduate students, was talking to the group about how, a particular block he was having difficulty burning, and he was burning it during the dormant season. Mainly to get a little bit more grass coverage to try to, make it to where he could get a little bit better burn coverage in that area. So, yeah, I think oftentimes we break things into these discrete categories with fire, but, for research purposes, obviously it makes sense to burn something the same time every year to see those differential fire effects. But for managers, I wouldn't recommend that for the most part. I would recommend, burning during different times on different areas. You might burn it in the winter one year and, the late growing season the next year, obviously depending on your objectives and the conditions and so on and so forth.
Well, I think one of the important things to think through here is having knowledge of the fire effects at different times and the knowledge of how fire frequency affects things is important. But what is probably the most important is for you to be able to evaluate outcomes and adjust your burning to achieve your objective. And being able to evaluate the outcome and whether or not that is whether or not it needs to be adjusted what you're doing to
Yeah.
better achieve your objective.
Let the plants tell you when to burn.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good rule of thumb. I think a lot of times, we get caught up using these windows of, 2 year, 3 year, 1 year. Sometimes we may recommend burning annually, but if you can't implement a fire annually, then you obviously, it's not worth trying to go out there and burn every year if there's not enough fuel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think from my perspective, it's really about making sure you're utilizing the fire window so that you can get your burning done to achieve your objectives. And, all these other considerations really are secondary to that frequency. And, expanding the burn window for a lot of people just helps them achieve that frequency.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's something that we see, regardless of the study. There's another site that Dr. Harper has that's a demonstration area at a Bridgestone Firestone Wildlife Management area, and that's been ongoing for um, at least a decade. I think longer than that. And he's got different timings paired with different frequencies of fire. And we do see some effect based on timing with regards to especially like native warm season grasses tend to be promoted more with early growing season compared to late growing season fire. But the overwhelming effects are based on frequency. You tend to have more forbs if you burn more often. You tend to have more trees if you burn less often, and this is on a 1, 2, and 3 year frequency. So even if you're only burning it every 3 years, you're going to have more trees, encroaching in that stand compared to something you burn annually. So I totally agree that the frequency is the number one driver of plant response.
Yeah, I mean, I've really tried to emphasize that oftentimes to landowners and managers, and to the point that I've even just made up numbers before because we don't really know. But I would guess that you could say that the vast majority of fire effects come from frequency. Maybe 60-70% of what you're going to get in terms of response is associated with the frequency that you're burning at, and the rest of it is probably associated with seasonality.
And I think a lot of the seasonal response, which I think we'll get to here in a minute, is tied mostly to just the intensity of the fire, or at least, is strongly related to the intensity of the fire, because there are real differences in intensity based on season.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we were talking about before we started recording that I think is very interesting is, burning in different systems during the same time of the year can result in very different intensities and very different fire effects as a result of that. So, like maybe, burning during one time of the year in a field, you get a much higher intensity there during that time of the year than you would at burning at the same time of the year in a forested environment. And so as a result of that, you see different plant community responses. So I think that's just one more thing to keep in mind for people as we're going through these results that, this was an upland hardwood system in the Mid-South. And, Mark told you a little bit about the species composition a minute ago. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're going through some of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, it's going to be a different response that you would see in fields or even within pine systems to some extent. I would say it's more similar to pine systems than fields, but
Right.
again, that depends on a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, when I looked through the paper, there were several things, and I even reached out to you before I did a reel on this. Some of our audience may have seen, but uh, it was kind of interesting some of the patterns that you observed in this publication compared to what I was used to in the systems that I was working in, and some of the things that I have said, and I've heard Craig Harper say, and I've heard various people say things that some of the results here are a little bit different than.
Yeah.
So then I was like, wait a minute, have I been saying this wrong, or
Yeah.
is this just different? So
well, that's why we had that
some differences.
conversation before we started recording. Is I was like, hold up, let me make sure that everything I've been saying is not wrong. But so with that, let's just jump straight into it and talk a little bit about the differential responses among different functional groups of plants.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, just to emphasize, this wasn't just one burn. This was 6 burns over the course of a 12-year period. Again, this is we're looking at the cumulative effects of all those burns. And whenever we sampled this, I think another important thing to keep in mind, we sampled this the growing season immediately after the last 2 fire events. So we were about 3 months after that early growing season fire and about 8 months after the late growing season fire, which that timing of sampling is typically what we would do because that makes the most sense with regards to seeing the greatest difference in response. But I think that's important context.
So you're sampling when the animals
Yes,
would be using it for a given purpose, right?
yes. So we were sampling these in late June and early July, and really, that time frame, especially from a turkey perspective, we're really thinking about brooding. But obviously, nesting is not occurring during that time. But we wouldn't expect to see huge changes in structure between, say, May when they were nesting and when we sampled in June. At least the relative difference in structure should still be there. So we think there are still some implications for nesting turkeys, but really a lot of the results are most easily translated with brooding.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever we looked at the and compared the units that were cut and burned, regardless of the fire seasonality, we saw greater coverage of forbs, grasses, brambles, and shrubs. So no surprise there. We cut trees and we burn. Over time, we get more herbaceous plants as well as some increases in woody plants and brambles as well. We did see differences based on seasonality with 2 of those plant types. So we actually saw more bramble coverage as well as more tree coverage in the understory following late growing season fire compared to early growing season fire. So again, that fall burning, you're tending to see more coverage of especially blackberry and then a lot of understory trees with fall versus spring burning.
Yeah, see, that's the opposite of what I would have expected. I would have expected more brambles and trees responding to early growing season fire.
Yes, and that's where the context becomes important. So, as I said before and mentioned before, we saw lower temperatures whenever we burn. So we, and I should back up how we measured that. We put out data loggers paired with thermocouples, which essentially is like a meat thermometer paired with a little computer that tells you, tracks the temperature over time.
How hot is it?
Yes, and so exactly. So we put those out in those units during each of the 2 seasons, and interestingly enough, it's not that hot burning those stands. You might think it's 500 degrees or something like that. I don't know what I would think a fire was, but interestingly, the temperatures were actually slightly less than 200 degrees Fahrenheit when we burned in the late growing season on average. Compared to 320 degrees Fahrenheit with early growing season fire. And that's not related to the way that we burn the stand. So it's not like in the early growing season, we were just throwing out head fires, and in the late, we were using backing. We predominantly used backing as well as some flanking fires. So that's just related to the difference in fuel moisture and conditions. But again, that less intense fire during the late growing season also related to it having reduced coverage. So again, we had about 65% coverage on average. So essentially, less intense fire, slightly less coverage compared to the early growing season. And so that's just allowing the brambles and trees over time. Some of them are not being top killed during every fire event. And that's just allowed them over time to increase in coverage compared to burning during the early growing season.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mark, when you were talking about the fuel moisture and how complete the burn was in the stands, and I started thinking, are the fires being carried primarily by leaf litter, or is it something other? Is it?
Yeah,
leaf
so
litter?
we only had 15 to 20% grass coverage in these stands. So yeah, it's predominantly leaf litter is what's carrying it. And on that last burn that we implemented in both the late and early growing season, we actually did get almost 100% coverage on both. That 65% average is just cumulative over those 6 fire events in the late growing season. But again, even though we did get, I would say, almost complete top kill during that last fire event during either fire season, just that cumulative effect of several of the fires in the late growing season being less intense has allowed those brambles and trees to inch up in coverage. Something I will note, though, is, of course, this might be common sense, but we also had a unit that is just a shelterwood harvest with no fire, and that's just a complete mid-story. There's no plants in the understory now after 13 years. We didn't go into that in the paper because we didn't do some of the sampling within those stands. But of course, fire during either season was able to maintain it in a more desirable condition for deer, turkeys, variety of other wildlife
It's
species.
almost not even usable.
Exactly. So I mentioned that just to say that although coverage is creeping up in brambles and trees in the late growing season, it's still a lot better than if we hadn't burned it at all.
That's a good
I
point.
was a little bit surprised to hear you say that you only had 15 to 20% coverage of grass. Do you think that that's because sunlight was too limited to allow that number to creep higher?
Yes,
Yeah.
as well as just competition with understory trees, and I think that's a huge thing to think about with the context of our study and anybody working in hardwoods. There are, of course, some similarities in managing hardwoods and pines. You're typically going to promote cutting trees and burning as good ways to increase understory forage and cover for deer and turkeys, etc. But the difference is in hardwoods, you have a constant seed source that is dropping seed into that stand every single year. In pines, of course, we have pine trees that drop seed, but especially if it's loblolly, you're able to kill those with fire pretty easily. And if it's sweet gum, we have good herbicide options. If there are sweet gum within the stand, we have good herbicide options to kill those. And unless you have sweet gum either outside the stand or inside the stand casting seed, that's typically not that big of an issue. One-time herbicide application, and that's taken care of. With hardwoods, that's not the case. So not only do we have rootstock and a seed source within the stand that is constantly being added, we don't have any good soil active herbicides such as imazapyr that we can apply safely in hardwoods. And even if we did, which of course, if we did apply those in hardwoods, as a broadcast application, we would kill a bunch of the trees most likely. Even if we did have that option for a good broadcast pre and post emergence herbicide option in hardwoods, it really wouldn't matter because within a couple of years, the soil, any of that herbicide would have been washed out of the soil solution, and an acorn drops, and suddenly you have a new oak seedling that's being established. Which, from a forestry perspective, is great that we have additional oak seedlings, and a lot of the seedlings within these stands were desirable species. We certainly, with fire, were improving the species composition of those stands, but that may cause some structural issues over time, especially if we don't keep that fire frequency up. And I think that's a big thing to consider when you have we had anywhere from 30 to 50% coverage of understory trees. Even if the structure is good for a brood, you've got to keep your foot on the gas and keep burning that stand just to keep that structure appropriate for those birds.
So, Mark, a couple of things. One, I'd comment, the shelterwood and fire technique was originally developed as a silvicultural system to promote regeneration of oak.
Absolutely.
Right.
So, I think our audience is aware of that, but I just wanted to make that comment. A couple of other things I was thinking through. Since leaf litter is the principal fuel that's carrying fire, it makes a lot of sense to me, even if you hold everything else constant, that the fire intensity would be slightly lower in the fall because it's before leaf drop. So all the leaf litter has had nearly a full year to decompose and gone through the summer, whereas all of the leaf litter in that early growing season hasn't even gone through an entire growing season, or at least the top layer.
Right.
Which I would not have appreciated as much if I hadn't have worked with a forest ecologist who got me to put a bunch of leaves in these little sacks. Have y'all ever done this?
No.
Where you actually measured the decomposition rate? So I've done that a few times with some different experiments as another thing we were measuring. And those, it's pretty amazing how fast the leaf litter decomposes. Like by the time you're getting around to that fire, it is definitely substantially decomposed compared to, your early season fire. So you probably did have a higher volume of fuel, that was crispy and ready to, to burn. Whereas a lot of the stuff had been partially decomposed. It would still be organic, but it's much more prone to holding moisture in the fall, after it's decomposed some. So that was one thought. Another question, and I don't know if you have any idea or if you can even speculate on it, but I was curious about it, and I get asked something along these lines a lot. This study is long term. You had 6 fires, I think you said, on average.
Yep.
Do you know if the fire spread from those early fires, did that change over time as you re-entered the stands with fire over and over? Did you start to see it become more flammable or less flammable or any sort of changes that were noticeable?
Yeah, so I can't comment on that. I was only present for 2 of the burns out of all those. Um, I would have to look back and also call a few of the students that were here at that time. Unfortunately, I don't have good data on that.
Yeah, I suspected you weren't sure, but I thought you might have the data, so that'd be something interesting to look into, whether or not the proportion of the stands had some sort of trend with time.
Yeah, that's
So,
a good point. And there definitely have been, changes. I mean, obviously between the control having, which again, it wasn't burned, but the composition is certainly different in the control compared to those stands where the shelterwood harvest was implemented, because we were leaving, primarily species with good flammability of the leaves.
Yeah, the other thing I wonder about such a long-term study, and Mark, you may probably weren't there long enough to observe this either, but maybe you saw some data on it. Has the composition kind of reached? I mean, I know it's going to change a little bit here and there from year to year, just based on the conditions when you burn and the fire intensity and so on and so forth. But I wonder if it's kind of reached somewhat of a steady state now, where you kind of tend to see overall the general composition by functional group of plant is kind of where it's going to stay, as long as you stay on that 2-year rotation, either in the early or late growing season.
Yeah, I would say that's probably the case. I mean, of course, we don't know exactly, but just based on, I actually sampled this stand while working as a technician back in 2015,
Okay.
and the data then and the stand then looked relatively similar to how they are now. There may be a few differences with regards to maybe species richness or something like that, but in terms of structure and just general plant classes, I don't think it's probably changed much over time. I think it's probably reached kind of a stable state, if you will, assuming the fire intensity and fire frequency stays constant.
Yeah, the
I
reason
think
I wanted to ask
yeah,
that
go ahead.
is, sorry, Marcus, but we were recently on another podcast and we kind of got asked about that indirectly, as to how many rotations does it take for the stand to fully realize the effects of that fire prescription. And I've always assumed that it's like after 2 or 3 fires at a given rotation length and seasonality, that you're probably kind of seeing the bulk of what you're going to get. But I also don't really have any data to support that.
Well, I think in that instance, we said something between the two of us. We both addressed it. I think we said something along the lines of, you can get, if you get enough sunlight penetration and you get fire into these stands, you can get to a high quality, community and structure of plants for your objectives, if they're related to turkeys or deer, at least fairly quick. And that sounds like what the data may support, Mark, even in that study, is that you may have had these dramatic changes in the understory structure when that thin happened and really sunlight, and then the first fire or two probably, and then by 6 fires in, sounds like it's been relatively stable.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, just speculating, I would say it's less than 20 and more than 1 is probably the number it takes to get to a stable state.
You thinking about running for office? So now I really want to get into this very interesting figure, which is figure 6 in this paper that has some information on turkey use of the different plots.
Hey now.
Yeah, I know Will's thinking through and thinking, okay, if I have 1 turkey per day, then I should only have to sit there for 1 or 2 days before a gobbler walks by.
Well, it depends. How far can he see my decoy from? Is my blind concealed?
And
if you put your fan out in front of you, then he ought to be able to see it from a long way.
Well, does Will have pocket corn or not? That's what
I don't leave home without that.
Yeah. So we also, as part of this study, did what any good hunter would do, and we threw some trail cameras out in the stand, which you see behind the curtain a little bit. It's like we could just put some cameras out and see what the animals do.
Yeah.
So we put some cameras out in the stands, and we put them out between May and August. So we were also looking at deer use during, especially fawning, but and lactation for does, as well as antler growth for bucks. But from a turkey perspective, really, we're centering in on that brooding period. Of course, you're also going to have detections of gobblers and jakes that are, foraging in the stands and loafing and things like that. But, really the structure that we were, trying to promote with these different fires, at least theoretically, should have improved it for brooding. And so we're interested to see whether we got more turkey detections in the areas that we burned during either season. And so we kind of broke it down into 2 periods. Early summer during that May and June timeframe, late May to through June would have been, really the time period whenever we would expect to see a little bit stronger selection based on, just the size of the poults. And then we also looked at things during July and August, when maybe there's a little bit more flexibility in the type of vegetation they could use. But there's also been a greater time since fire, so that structure is going to be a little bit taller. So you kind of got a couple different things going on during those 2 different periods. But what we found was that we had about 500% more pictures of turkeys in the early growing season units compared to the late growing season units during May and June. So pretty good amount more. And comparing the early growing season to the control, where again, we didn't cut trees, we didn't burn, we had about 730% more turkey detections in the early growing season. So during May and June, that early growing season was really promoting a lot of good turkey detections, which again, point of emphasis here, we're only talking 1 to 2 months after fire. This is the vegetation was fairly short and it's resprouting. And of course, new seeds were germinating during that time period, but that's in that short period immediately after fire.
Mark, just for our audience to make sure they have context, when would nesting be peaking?
In our system, it would be late April, early May.
Okay, so you're basically burning right in the middle of nesting.
Yes.
Okay.
Essentially, it would probably. I would say we're typically burning before, especially incubation. But it is occurring. Most of those burns did occur. At least when we could expect some turkeys to be nesting. Yes.
Yeah.
I had a joke about that earlier, Marcus, but you cut me off, so I didn't get to it.
Oh, man. Well, I was going to provide a disclaimer before our audience pauses and sends a bunch of hate mail to Mark. We do have an episode on this. So I would encourage you to go listen to that one. I forgot what number that is, but it was with Dr. Chris Mormon.
Yeah, and a key point before I get any further, these, we had 4 stands across the area, and each of the treatments within those stands was 2 acres. So we're literally talking about burning a 2-acre patch.
Right.
We didn't observe any turkeys being flushed out of there. There's obviously a chance that it could have happened, but it's 2 acres on a huge WMA.
I think the point also should be emphasized that then right in the peak of brooding, when you're a month and a half after you burned, which happened to be during
Absolutely.
nesting, the turkey use, what was the magnitude that you said?
500% more turkeys in the early than the late in May and June.
But how much more than not burning?
700% more. Yeah.
That's pretty substantial. The turkeys are telling us they like it.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Like 700 times, 700% increase, not 700 times, 700%.
Yeah.
That's pretty substantial.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we got to consider scale during that, but as I said before, backing up a little bit, in these systems, a lot of the cover that's being produced is going to be driven by woody species. We only had 20% forb coverage in these stands. Would it be great if it was 50%? Yes, but just reality with that constant seed cast, the woody structure within those stands is most of what is going to be used by poults, and so maintaining it at a short height pretty much requires burning during at least the late dormant season, but I think there's good things to be said about burning some during the early growing season in order to promote that shorter structure during that especially early brooding period.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
and I think another important point to make there is, you mentioned you only had 20% coverage of forbs, but in the control you had like what, 1-2%,
Yeah, it was very low.
almost zero.
basically.
Yeah.
But the point that I was going to emphasize is, we talk about it regularly, how important fire is for turkeys for various reasons, not just brooding, but also nesting, to promote nesting cover. But to me, that data kind of illustrates the importance of having some areas that have just been burned. Right? Like when you're going into brooding season, I'm not saying that you need to do that necessarily during nesting. That wasn't my point. It is that if you burn in the same year that the brooding occurs in, whether or not that's in the nesting season, depends on how much you need to burn, I guess, and what your burn window looks like. But, having that available is probably pretty important for brooding.
Absolutely. And I think another, take home is having it, within close proximity. So right across the fire break from where we have that early growing season burn, we have the late growing season, which, as I said before, did not see that much turkey use during May and June. And it also didn't see hardly any during July and August. So
still a lot more than not, oh no, actually I was reading that wrong. It was actually less than, no, it was the same as the control. Okay.
Yeah. So during any period during the summer, we really did not see that much turkey use in the late growing season burn units. However, the structure within those units was excellent for nesting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we didn't have tag birds, so we can't say that any nested there. Also, it wouldn't have mattered if we had cameras out during peak nesting because we wouldn't have expected to get pictures of, there's no way to know they're on a nest or anything like that.
Just nest right in the middle
right
of the
in front of the camera. Yeah.
that
So,
has happened
so we don't know
apparently
that.
to a few people.
Jeez. But so we don't know that. But if you look at the literature, the structure was essentially perfect for nesting, at least based on what we know from the literature. And that was right across the fire break from the early growing season stands. And the early growing season stands, again, that were burned 2 months prior to brooding, were the only stands where we got pictures of poults.
Mm-hmm.
So again, they probably weren't being produced in the early growing season stand, because if a turkey tried to lay a nest in there in April, it would have been not much growing there, assuming it was before the fire occurred or after the fire occurred. It would have pretty much just been blackened out. But we were promoting that high quality brooding or nesting structure right across the fire break from the brooding structure.
Yeah. I'm going to go out on a big hickory limb and suggest that they're probably not being produced in the closed canopy unburned forest either.
Exactly.
But what I do like that point, that's kind of illustrating having multiple times of fire and using that as, not only is it opening the burn window and helping you accomplish the burning. But if you're doing it in close proximity, you can take advantage of the different characteristics in the plant community that it is promoting. In this case, it seems like they pair really well because one promotes high quality nesting cover while the other promotes high quality brooding cover.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think something else that's important to think about from this too is I have been on some sites in the South that are so productive that even if they're burned during late winter time during the dormant season, they already are too dense for brooding cover
Mm-hmm.
by the time the poults are on the ground in late May.
Yep.
And I think that that's, another one of those arguments that, or another reason that I've made the argument for diversification of fire seasonality on properties managed for turkeys.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
Will and I know we've at least one person we both talked to together where we're trying to figure out herbicide options to deal with it because they literally burn in dormant season and it's too dense already.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a high productivity, high sunlight
Yeah.
circumstance, but
12 ounces of imazepit can slow that down.
Yeah, well, that's where we arrived. But that's a good point. Having a diversity of timing, you're more likely, especially when you're kind of doing it in close proximity, you're more likely to better achieve, the conditions needed for multiple life stages for something like a turkey.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of driving this home in terms of the importance of having something recently burned. Whenever we backed out to July and August, we actually saw 20 times more turkey detections in the early growing season compared to the late growing season. So again, just kind of driving that point home that, it gets worse as time goes on. We see, less and less use.
Do you think
not to suggest we don't need to burn during the late growing season. It's just that that's providing resources during different times than during that brooding period that we're focusing on.
Well, that late growing season fire was high quality structure during nesting, which is earlier in the year. So
exactly.
Do you think that response is being driven by the plants that actually, the area that was burned and the progression of plants in that area, or is part of that because of the lack of continuity and fire spread? Like, what do you think the relative importance of those were?
I think at least whenever we had the cameras out, it was probably mostly being driven by the types of plants and the structure that was resulting because of that. Because again, during that last late growing season fire in 2022, it was on a pretty dry conditions, and we got over 90% coverage on all the stands.
That's right. Yeah. So the 60-something% that you gave was an average over a lot of burns.
Yeah, and some of them were like 50% coverage. So,
and I'm looking at the visual obstruction figure right now, and if you look at the late growing season, it was obvious that there was much denser, taller vegetation at turkey height than there was in the early growing season burn units.
Yeah, absolutely. So both of them increased cover, between the ground and about 3 feet up. Compared to the control, which is what we would expect. The control, pretty much wide open with a little bit of mid-story. So both of them increased structure up to about 3 feet. But that early growing season fire promoted wide open structure between about 3 to 6.5 feet, which is, that not exactly the mid-story, but essentially that, that area that we want to be open for a hen to be able to detect predators. Whereas the late growing season fire, that was pretty dense, which is actually, matches up well with some of the stuff that we did in Auburn. Obviously not looking at seasonality, but during my thesis work, we found a lot more visual obstruction in that upper strata, from 3 to 6.5 feet in areas where we cut trees and did not apply fire compared to areas where we did burn. So again, that recent fire is really, really important for, to keep that mid-story level more open, that a hen can, feel comfortable using it. And also for other life history. I mean, it's not like a gobbler's going to want to walk through, a dense thicket either. Obviously we're focusing on brooding, but, I would say for all life histories for, foraging during the summertime, you want to have some openness.
Yeah. And
But
so, I mean, even though you got it sounds like you got more coverage of those, that last fire or two in the late growing season. What you're seeing in terms of that vegetation density at near ground level is kind of a culmination of the fire intensity and the fire coverage that occurred during that time of the year in your system on that study area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess we've covered a lot of the interesting stuff from this paper, but you have some deer stuff in here too. and
we don't
I
need to
joke,
cover
I,
that.
I thought y'all had me on here to talk about deer. I mean,
I joke, but yeah, a lot of our listeners, of course, are interested in managing for deer as well as turkeys. So, can you walk us through, how this affected deer use of the sites and deer forage as well?
I would say a lot of your listeners are interested in managing for turkeys as well as deer. But yeah. So we also looked at deer forage availability and deer use of those areas. And what we found was, in terms of deer use was greater in the areas where we applied fire compared to the controls during either period of the summer. But especially during that May and June period, we saw a lot greater deer use. I think about twice as much deer use in the early growing season compared to the late growing season units. Likely because of that, young fresh foliage that's being promoted, just 1 to 2 months after fire, whereas by July and August, that difference in forage qualities, decreasing. Of course, either unit promoted a lot more deer forage, but the early growing season tended to promote a little bit better quality of plants. Again, relating to that, a lot of the woody species resprouting, as well as, there were, forbs that we collected in those stands, but a lot of that's just related to those woody plants resprouting soon after fire. And so that early growing season tended to promote a little bit better forage quality that led to greater nutritional carrying capacity, which is essentially just a measure of how many deer that are lactating with twin fawns we could support on a given acre of land. And so that's just kind of incorporates availability or the biomass as well as the quality of those plants. And so we saw a little bit greater nutritional carrying capacity following early growing season fire compared to the late. But again, both had a lot more forage than the control stand. So and in terms of structure, again, coming back to that late growing season promoted really good fawning structure, which right across the fire break, there was young, fresh forage for a doe to consume. And so, she literally could drop her fawn in that area that had more structure and then go right across the fire break to feed and get that high quality forage that's available there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it kind of all comes together, for both deer and turkeys, obviously very different species, but whenever you think about the different life history requirements, having, different seasons of fire available on a small scale, can really increase the ability of those animals to maximize nutrition as well as survival. Hopefully,
Hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, I think another potential benefit of the late growing season burns too would be that you'd have, well, I presume, I mean, I know y'all were focused on growing season forage, but I would presume that due to the species composition of the late growing season units, they would have more winter browse available too.
yes, and they also would have depending on the time that we burn during the early growing season. Of course, there's going to be some period whenever there's no forage available within that stand in April and or
Hmm.
May, and so by burning during the late growing season, you're allowing those plants to be resprouting and younger and more nutritious during that time period when the early growing season isn't promoting anything.
Mm. That's a
So
good
yeah,
point.
there's definitely benefits of both timings to both deer and turkeys.
Yeah, I was gonna. It made me think of some parallels as well, and some of the work. The grad student Rainer Nichols was in my lab working on it, but we were comparing March burning to June burning in pine plantations, and they were thinned, and you know, we when we were looking at the use data in particular, and I was trying to think of whether or not we've gotten this part of it published. I can't remember what's in which paper now, but we have data on it showing the use by deer and turkeys and a couple of other species from cameras, and it was the same sort of trend that you're talking about. the use was really high for a window of time after the burn, but we would have, if we had burned a unit in October, we would have seen the same trend, I think, that you did during the following summer, comparing that to the March timeframe. But ours, instead, we were comparing March, which was the longer time since fire, to right after June fire. So we had early June we burned, and then looking at use in July and August, then it was quite a bit higher for the June fire than it was the March fire. So
Yeah, and kind of supporting what you're saying there, whenever we looked at deer, and I may have mentioned this, but when we looked at deer use in July and August, it was actually the same between whether we burned in April or October. And so that, again, really just emphasizing, at least from a deer perspective, you're only talking an increase in really having that strong magnet effect, if you will, for 1 to 2 months. It's not this extended period.
right.
Of course, there are benefits to fire for a deer in an area that was burned, within the last year compared to something that hadn't been burned for 5 years. When you're looking at that, those short, really strong effects are, they're very short lived.
Yeah. Well, even when we've looked at forage quality, and experiments looking at various times, the that pulse and quality that you get that's really attractive to deer is lost by the time you go through one growing season.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that the benefits of fire are lost, like you said a minute ago, but we're using fire in various ways to accomplish various things, and one thing that we could do is use it to cause a really high availability of highly concentrated nutrients in plants, and that is pretty short-lived.
Yeah, but I would argue that's a very similar effect to what we're seeing with brooding structure. I don't have the data. I don't have the data in front of me, but those stands, when we sample them 2 years after a burn, regardless of whether it's early or late growing season, it's not high quality brooding. Brooding cover.
It's nesting cover.
Sure. Turkeys might use it for brooding, but I would not expect they're selecting it. Now, it is within a landscape that's a lot of closed canopy woods, but it's certainly too dense by a year after fire.
When you have a fresh burn across the fire break, they're probably not going to use it then.
Yeah,
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I really like the image that you have. It's pretty clear. We can cut this in, online if folks are watching on YouTube, or if we do some reels or whatever. But it's really telling looking at the visualizing that plant community structure. Like it's exactly what you were describing to me when I look at those three pictures. Like, yeah, it's kind of like a wasteland when it's a control, but that late growing season, man, that looks like it's developing into some nice nesting cover, and they certainly ought to be brooding in that early growing season photo. So
yeah, most of the vegetation in that early growing season, in late June, is only about knee high. So it's
good, good looking stuff.
And you can see there's some openness at ground level, and you can even see some bare ground there. So certainly, a lot better structure. And so one thing I wanted to briefly mention that I don't want to get lost in the mix here is the importance of sunlight within these stands. Again, we had about 30% sunlight in these units because of a shelterwood harvest that was implemented. But some of the work that we did at Auburn was looking at forest stand improvement. And so if you're in a situation where you can't, get a commercial harvest, whatever the case is, forest stand improvement is a great technique to go through and kill the trees that you don't want. And then you can follow that up with fire during different times of year in order to meet whatever resources you're trying to provide for turkeys. And it's really fun. We did this just the other day. You can actually improve a stand within an afternoon. We applied FSI, and then we burned literally within an hour of applying FSI on like a 5-acre block. And that should be looking really good for turkeys this spring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. The sunlight is regulating the response first. If you don't release sunlight from limiting, then you're not going to get much out of the burning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we definitely need to link those photos. I mean, a picture is worth 1,000 words for sure in this case.
Yeah, it's really, really useful. I was scrolling through to see if there was anything I missed, and then I hit that photo and I was like, oh, yeah, there it is.
Mm-hmm.
All the things that were going on in this old noggin right here that was bouncing around is right there in that image.
That control's a great place for squirrel hunting, though.
Hey, now.
Yeah.
You know what?
Yeah,
Mark and I we squirrel hunted in a place like that this past fall together.
Did you?
We did.
And then we had a nice big meal with everybody from all the squirrels that we've got.
Fried up a bunch of squirrels. It was good.
Yeah, that was really good. We should do that every year.
We should.
Well, Mark, are we forgetting to ask you anything, or was there anything else you wanted to touch on?
Yeah, I don't think so. Again, I think that the big take home message is burn during different times, burn at a relatively small scale where possible, and burn frequently. I think a lot of times, especially with hardwoods, folks think almost you need to burn less often than you do when managing pines. I'm not going to necessarily say you need to burn more often to maintain the structure, but you need to burn frequently because those hardwood resprouts they're going to come back strong, and there's not a good option to get rid of them with one herbicide application or anything like that. So just that's the big take home. I think one other thing would mention is a lot of folks are worried about damaging hardwoods with fire, and be a little remiss if we didn't at least briefly cover that. And I think y'all have talked about it a fair amount. We didn't look at it in this study, but when we were working down in Auburn, we did look at hardwood damage, tree damage with fire, and this was just during the dormant season. But we found that only water oaks had any damage when we were working in those systems in the coastal plain, and of water oaks that were damaged, only 13% had any issues, and that was just minor cambium damage. So again, if you're working with upland oak species, as long as you burn it with low intensity, you shouldn't expect too much either value loss or killing trees. I know that's something that someone will comment. Well, what about my oaks?
Yeah, we've talked about that on here and written some articles and stuff. I think that's a good point. It's definitely a barrier that we need to bring up, that folks are afraid to burn because of they don't want to damage their oaks. So the other thing I would add to that as a kind of a closing thought on it is, if you are using forest stand improvement in particular, you might end up in a situation where you need to take some precaution. If you have a lot of down limbs and stuff from some of those dead trees and they get up against one of your prized oaks, take some time to go through the stand and make sure you don't have those large fuel sources up against your trees. And like you said, if you don't have that situation, you're using low intensity fire, you're probably going to be fine. But
absolutely.
If a limb catches up near the base of one of your trees, then that certainly can cause an injury to that tree. You definitely don't want that to be your white oak that rains it down.
Exactly. Yeah, these stands, after 6 fires, we still have trees in them, and they, look fine. So except for cases like what you said, where there was down limbs that we didn't catch. So I think that's a good take home.
So the answer to fire is yes.
Yes.
That's good.
Well, I already established recently that turkeys like fire, so
yeah, I think you did say that.
I don't have anything else to contribute.
You're starting to believe the turkeys like fire.
I'm coming around.
Yeah. You know what? I have gotten several images from folks that killed a turkey in a burned area this year. Have y'all gotten any of those?
Mm-hmm.
Man, it warms my heart.
Yeah. We're potentially, you and I are going to be hunting in a bunch of blacked out area.
I know it. I'm excited.
Here in a couple of weeks.
You know what? We didn't even tell my turkey story. I forgot about that. It's too late now.
Yeah, we'll save that for next week.
if we get 5 ratings saying that Will can't do math, then we'll do the turkey story next time.
Well, the bringing up the fresh burning, this week I've been hunting in a similar situation around some fresh burns, and there's nothing like the little lines you get against the bottomland just to add a little bit of to structure to your camo on your pants legs, walking through stems that have been burned.
Oh yeah.
We need to reach out to the Mossy Oak guys and tell them that they need to develop a burned bottomland camo pattern.
I love just having a burn stand camo.
Yeah, there's an idea.
That's good. And
next thing, get a drip torch holder for your turkey vest.
Oh man, that's hilarious.
Well, we appreciate your time, Mark.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, absolutely enjoyed
Good talking to you. A lot of fun. I'm glad to hear you're getting to chase a turkey or two. So I hope you have good luck with that.
Yeah, much appreciated, and same to y'all. It's that time of year.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody out there for listening. We really appreciate all the support and everything. And looking forward to hearing some good turkey stories. Share them with us if you have one. And appreciate you listening.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.